Back in 2014, the chess world lost an absolute genius at the game in Vugar Gashimov, the Azari grandmaster, at the very young age of 27 due to a brain tumor. And he left a legacy of games that were tremendously exciting. And I feature one of these today where he was playing in the European Team Championships for Azerbaijan against the Netherlands. And so it's a four-player competition, and he was trying to lead Azerbaijan to a great result and the win of the tournament. And in this game, he's playing against Daniel Stellwagen of the Netherlands. So let's use the new Stockfish 13 and see if we can look at some old classic games and see what kind of evaluation it gives us and see how it might compare with previous engines. So we turn on Let's Check. So it's Gashimov with the white pieces, and it's Sakura Khan. So d4 and d5 is played by black, and the advanced variation. And so bishop to f5, knight to f3 by Gashimov, and e6. So standard opening here in the advance. And now Gashimov decides to go with bishop to e2. And black plays the usual undermining move in the center with c5. So the idea is to target the pawn on d4. So after being a little bit compressed, black now attacks the center. So bishop to e3. And black decides to take, and its knight takes in return, hitting the bishop on f5. So it's n to c7 by black. Knight to d2. And knight b to d6. So black is bringing out the minor pieces with the idea of having a strong attack on both the e5 and d4 squares. So the the knight on d2 develops to f3, and then we have the bishop shifting to g4. So getting away from the attack square on f5 and coming into the g4. Castles by white, and then e6, fairly slow move played by black. And as you can see in the evaluation here, the engine's not overly thrilled with this. Other options here, if we go back into the opening book theory, you could take on f3. This bishop would recapture and really have, although good influence over the center squares, black's pawn structure is quite strong. So white continues with r to c1, another good developing move. And we have bishop now taking a move later on f3. And this is another interesting decision where Gashimov decides to recapture with the knight, with the idea that if the bishop recaptures on f3, it's that same problem. It'll just simply run in a d5, and although it has good central square influence, it's not really so good with the black pawn well supported on d5. So we get n takes f3, and now g6. So the idea of a fianchetto on the black side, on the king side. So black is attempting to develop his last minor piece with the bishop on f8. So Gashimov, after playing the rook move to c1, gets in with c4, so directly undermining the center. We have bishop to g7 in the fianchetto. And so white has to be careful to hold this pawn. It's already under attack on e5. We see that the knight on c6 and the bishop on g7 are both doing a good job of attacking it. Gashimov takes on d5, and then we have the black queen into the game on d5 with recapture. So a decision here for Gashimov about whether to leave the queens on the board. And we can see the valuation, and this is an interesting point, that if you look at the valuations here by, for example, Houdini, which is not considered, I don't think, much of a strong engine anymore, 0.17, so basically even. Stockfish 13 showing a sizable lead for white at this point. So Gashimov decides to keep the queens on the board with queen a4, and now queen a5. So Stellwagen's attempting to get the queens to trade, and Gashimov just simply drops back with queen to b3. So rejecting the trade of the queens and also protecting the a2 pawn as well. So we get castle by black. So he's finally developed all his minor pieces. He'll attempt to undermine this pawn on e5. We get bishop to c5 by Gashimov, and supported by the rook here on c1. This rook on f1 can easily come to the open d file, and a good attack on this knight that is stuck back here on e7. So we have rook f to e8, which seems a little strange. Supports the knight, but kind of running into this pawn structure on the e file. So generally you want to get to an open file. So bit of an interesting decision by black there. And now bishop to d6. So directly getting into the center squares, also in a backwards way, supporting the pawn on e5 as well. So an excellent position for Gashimov's bishop on d6. Then we get knight takes e5, so black very keen to undermine the pawn structure in the center. And Gashimov taking with the knight on e5. Bishop, strong bishop now on g7, now captures on e5. And instead of capturing here, it's a very interesting move, r to c5. So this is a double threat. So hitting the queen and hitting the bishop as well. So best move for white here. We have queen to d2. So black's queen coming right into the white position. So very interesting dynamic game arising out of the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann. Bishop takes on e5 by Gashimov. And then queen taking the bishop on e2. So white has given up the bishop pair, but for a queen that, although kind of intruding into white's position, maybe a little bit misplaced. And now there is the issue of some hanging pawns. So the b7 pawn is a little bit loose, so Gashimov decides to take on b7. And if we look at the Stockfish analysis, the evaluation is still about even. But a good 2-to-1 pawn majority on this side. Now into d5, sensible move by black coming into the center, controlling more squares and well supported by the pawn on e6. And we get bishop to g3. So dropping back and white indicating that he wants control over the dark squares along this diagonal. We get ra to d8, so black developing the rook into the semi-open file on the d file. And then slow move by white, just simply h3, bit of a prophylactic move, and the best one, as the engine confirms. And good control over the g4 square when this is played, and maybe preventing the queen from arriving on g4, if that was what black was intending to do. So h3 here. And then rook to e7, trying to get a tempo on the queen. So asking the white queen where it wants to move. And again, white goes back to b3 with the queen. Rook e to d7 by black, and now Stellwagen's lining up the rooks on the d file. So once this knight moves, his rooks will be in an excellent position to not only harass the queen, but potentially come to the back rank as well. And this gives an opportunity to Gashimov to play his last piece, which really should develop on f. And the machine suggesting that white do the same here and play rook f2 to c1. And that was the strongest move. And again, keeping strong control over the c file, completely open, unlike black's semi-open d file. But Gashimov instead decides to go with a3 and a bit slower move, so giving up a little bit of an opportunity there, but not a huge change in valuation. So again, the game's still relatively even. So we have h5 by black, so using the 4-3 pawn majority on the king side to expand and take space. And now we have r to c2. So a tempo on the black queen. And black decides to retreat the queen to b5 again, asking white if he's willing to exchange queens. And Gashimov, of course, doesn't do this and goes to f3. So very determined to keep the queens on the board, and also this rook has good control over b2 as well. So we have knight to e7. So a bit of a retreating move, attempting to reposition the knight potentially to c6, although it's under attack by two pieces right now. And now bishop to c7. So very invasive move by white here, attacking the rook on d8. Rook to c8, and this rook is of course pinned. And so now Gashimov does develop his final rook and gets rf to c1 in. With all his pieces in the game now. We have queen to d5, again asking for the trade of queens. And another interesting option here is that queen f4 was a possibility as well. So this would get out of the way of the opposing queen and also support the bishop on c7. But instead, Gashimov goes with queen e2, again avoiding the trade, and now queen to b7. So three pieces now attacking the bishop on c7, and so white has to retreat, and now it's a huge change in evaluation now. Now this is quite interesting. So on bishop, and we're just looking at the depth of 23 here, Gashimov does play the best move in bishop to e5. But what you see here is almost a pawn advantage at this point. And if you look at the other engines that have gone to quite a strong depth, Komodo and even Stockfish 11, so two versions prior. So the Komodo engines evaluated this as good for white, but not nearly as much as Stockfish 13. But now the predecessor, two iterations ago of Stockfish 11, had this at 1.33, but now we see Stockfish 13 evaluating it as only 0.75 of a pawn. So an advantage for white, but maybe not as optimistic as the previous versions of Stockfish. So bishop drops back to e5, very good square, centrally controlling all kinds of good squares here, and solid control in the center. So rook takes on c2, so black decides to capture. And we have the rook could recapture as well, but Gashimov decides to play queen takes c2. And now we have rook to d5, threatening the bishop on e5. So queen goes to c3 to support the bishop. Again, top line move by the engine. And now king to h7. So a couple options for Gashimov here. And he could have potentially gone with queen to f3. But the interesting thing is that b4 is indicated. And that makes a lot of sense by the engine, because if you have b4, you're starting to really push the 2-to-1 pawn majority. Black isn't quite doing enough yet with this 4-to-3 majority on the king side. So why not push the queen side pawns and see what could be made out of it? But instead, bishop going into h8 with the idea, of course, of checkmate potentially on g7. And then we have knight to f5. So defending those key squares. And so b4, again, recommended, but white deciding here to pursue the king side. And this was a bit of a missed opportunity by Gashimov. He could have done b4 again here, but instead goes with g4. With the idea of, on a pawn recapture, if we can move this knight, then of course it would be checkmate on g7. So now e5 by black, impeding the connection between the white bishop and queen. And so we simply have g takes f5, and this gives white the opportunity to open the position at the expense of a trade of minor pieces, but ideally completely breaking open black's pawn structure. So now we have f takes g6. So white attempting to completely disrupt the kingside pawn structure while keeping his 2-to-1 majority on the queen side. So very good strategy. F takes g6. And now we see this on the f file, no pawn now. And so this isolated pawn that could be focused on by both sides. By white on directing pressure on e5. So now queen to c6. And just breaking into the black position, looking at the targets, specifically on g6, right near the opposition king. So offering a trade of queens. Queen does take, and rook takes back. And now there are 2 pawn targets in the black camp. So black decides to play a5, getting rid of one of them. This one is still a target. And so white takes the opportunity and captures there. So now it's 4 pawns to 3. So it's going to be a very interesting rook endgame with the kings needing to get into the game and some possible targets for black here too, especially on b2. So king to h7 by black, so trying to bring the king into the game and also getting a tempo on the rook. So rook goes to b6. a6 was also possible, with the idea of attacking or putting pressure on the a5 pawn. But instead, Gashimov decides to get to the open file and support his weak pawn on b2. King to g7. So black unable to cross the 6th rank because of the white rook, but trying to get the king to a more central space to get it into, likely support the pawn on e5. Then we have a4 by white. And now the evaluation is getting up to almost a pawn for white, so starting to get somewhat of an advantage. And if white can hold this, they should have very good prospects in the endgame. But there was looks like a bit of a missed opportunity, because at this point, white, according to the engine, probably should have taken advantage to continue the push, similar to what black is doing here, and get the king into the game. So king to g2 is suggested by both Stockfish 13 and 11, so that was a possibility. But a4 good too, looks like. So a4 is played, and now we're up to d4, threatening this pawn, and white simply playing b3 to support the pawn on a4. Then we get rook to d3, and now an opportunity for white to continue the king development and get the king into the game. But at this point, what the engine is suggesting is that rook to e6 be played. And this was a bit of a miss by white. And that would, of course, target the e-pawn. And the king cannot come to f6, of course, to support it. So let's play that out. Let's see what would happen. So it looks like the only saving move would be, and then if rook were to try to go to d5 to try to hold that, then we'd simply have h4. And then black would have to try to, let's say a random king move, like let's say to there. And then we have rook to h6. So if the king comes away from g7, then this pawn would be targeted. And then if, let's say, rook to h6, suggested by the engine, if this is, let's say, pushed, so that the black rook is now supporting on h5, then we would simply get king to f1, bringing the king into the control of the center, with the idea of now king to e2, and eventually heading towards the pawn on e4 as a target. So king of g2 is played, and then e4, so black keen to push that pawn and put some pressure on white's position. And now Stockfish evaluating that white is up about a pawn and a half. And it's quite interesting here Because if you look at the comparison, and this is interesting that Stockfish 8 comes up, and this was probably actually used to analyze this game back at the time, maybe it was played or just thereafter, because Stockfish 8 actually evaluated this almost a full pawn stronger for white than Stockfish 13 is saying, which is interesting. So you can see this comparison of these evaluations now with the newer engine, and actually now even less than a pawn. So that's actually quite interesting. But lots of good moves available for white still. So h4, r to b5, for example. And again, attacking both these pawns, that makes a lot of sense. So if we get to b5, then both h5 and a5 would be targets. And so we come back to the game, and it does indeed, white does indeed go r to b5. So now king to g6, allowing the king to come forward to the 6th rank. And in this case, if there's a capture here, the rook could simply just recapture on b3. So white decides not to do that, wants to keep the king out and take a square away, and also remove h3 as a target, and simply plays h4. King goes to h6, so sort of a waiting move and staying in touch with the pawn on h5. And then now we have a huge advantage for white at this point. But again, interestingly enough, not as optimistic as the evaluation by Stockfish 2 versions ago. So about 2 on r to e5, which would make a lot of sense. So trading pawns and then playing r to e5, threatening this pawn in the center. So white's trying to retain these 2 pawns versus the black pawn on h5 with a full trade of the pawns. If you look at the evaluation of Stockfish 11, r to b6 was evaluated as a full 4 pawn advantage. But if you look at r to b6 in Stockfish 13, it's less than 2 pawns. So half as good as what Stockfish 11 was saying. And this is what we're seeing, is that some positions Stockfish 13 is more optimistic, and some like a lot less optimistic. So in this case, r to e5, threatening the pawn. We have r takes b3. And this was a huge loss of initiative here by white. So r takes a5 was absolutely essential. So Gashimov misses that, and r to e5 sort of targeting the wrong pawn at this point. So big drop in valuation here. So r takes b3, and now white decides to take the central pawn with r takes e4. We get r to a3, threatening the pawn on a4, of course. f3 by Gashimov, and now king to g6. So playing a waiting move, trying to get the king in the path of the white pawn here. We have king to g3. So Gashimov trying to get his king into the game further, and then king to f6, centralizing the black king. We have king to f4, and again, the valuation here almost back to even. So big missed opportunity by the white here. r to a1, trying to come around the backside, maybe attack h4. Always a good idea to go behind the opponent's pawns in the endgame, in a rook endgame. r to c4, and r to a3, repeating the position. So Stockfish 13 thinking white's ahead by about a third of a pawn. King to e4 here, not allowing any checks and staying in touch with the pawn on f3. And now king to e6, f4, rook to a1, again threatening the king with check and potentially targeting some of the white pawns. And in this case, r to c6 is played. So the black king cannot come forward, retreats to f7, and now just r to c4 returning. So a repeat of the position. Gashimov checks again, king back to f7, and now of course doesn't want to draw and plays king to f5, taking the opposition, shielding himself from capture, and also staying in touch with the f4 pawn. Then it's rook takes a4. So now the pawns are slowly coming off, and now rook to c7, pushing the black king back to the back rank. And now we have rook to a7. So keeping the black rook on the a file, otherwise he'll lose the pawn on a5, and potentially bringing the king forward to threaten with mate. We have already a1, so black trying to maneuver with the remaining rook, and now king to g6. And that opens up a check possibility. So r to g1 was available, but instead Stellwagen turns that down and plays a4, so he's just simply trying to push his remaining pawn. With the rook on a7, the black king, of course, cannot come down to assist. And now f5, so a bit of a pawn race developing. And now r to g1 is played. And in this case, king to f6, and the engine showing the game as absolutely drawish even. King to f6. So now king to g8. And we have white taking the passed pawn on the a file. We have rook to g4. Again, showing the game as absolutely dead drawn. R to a8. King to h7. R to a7 with another check. And now king to g8. Or 8-8. So position repeating. So Gashimov has to find something else. And in this case goes with king to f7. So again, the engine evaluation showing this is absolutely dead drawn. 0 evaluation across after 68 moves by each side. So black rook captures on h4. And now f6 is played. And now here r to f4. And this is where it all falls apart. So huge blunder here by black. And Stellwagen needed to find, there are multiple moves that draw. So you can see them here. So r to e4 was fine. R to c4 was fine. R to b4 was fine. R to h3 even dropping back to the third rank. And even r to h2 and h1. All of those were drawn. So he had 6 available moves to draw. But instead plays r to f4. And this is a massive blunder. Because now, on king to e6, the white king marches towards the black rook. And now there's, you can see the finish of the game is evaluated here. Mate is showing in 47, likely to maybe even tick down as it calculates further. So depth of 35, so now saying 58. So massive blunder by black here in an absolutely dead drawn position. King to e6, h4 is played. And was this right? This is interesting. Let's go back here. It had to be king to e6, right? So now h4 is played. And now simply f7. So this allows the pawn to promote. So black is thinking that it was a good idea to get to the f file where the pawn is, actually needed to take a roundabout route, get to some of these open files, and get back to the 7th rank. So now f7's played, king to g6, and now, of course, the pawn can promote with queen, and rook takes, and this is an absolutely one end game by white. So now king to g5, and now there's an evaluation that a mate is coming within about 21 moves at this point. But so black is dead lost here. There's no way they can save the pawn. So with good end game technique, Gashimov will put this away and win the game with the white pieces. So very interesting evaluation. King e5 and Stellwagen resigns. So fascinating to look at what Stockfish 13 thought of this game that was played quite a while ago, about 8 years at this, 7 years at this point. And, oh, I'm sorry, 2009. So it's actually about 12 years at this point. And so massive blunder by black at the end, but it was very interesting to see the changes, the difference in evaluation between Stockfish 13 and some of its competitors and predecessors during this game.